As Professor Kiter said, these are all folks that have been with us already. What the other characteristic of this group is, this is a group of people who have been worried about this issue for a long time. Every person up here has a real immediate stake in the problem now, but they've also been concerned on the problem for quite a while. We have Dr. Bonnie Baxter, director of the Great Salt Lake Institute, who is a professor at Westminster College. Moving on to just to get our professors out here first, we've got Dr. Kevin Perry, professor, Department of Atmospheric Resources. We've got two folks who have been in the legislature, but are currently not in the legislature, but we're working on the issues that are very much involved with the legislature. We've got Joel Ferry, Executive Director of the Department of Natural Resources, and we've got Tim Hawks, Vice Chair and General Counsel of the Salt Lake Shrimp Cooperative. And finally, we have Linda Freitas, who we heard from just maybe an hour or so ago, Executive Director of Friends of the Great Salt Lake. My name is Brigham Daniels. I'm a visiting professor here at the University of Utah. Okay, I just want to see first, by show of hands, how many of you here are hopeful that we actually are going to save the Great Salt Lake? I want to see hands. God bless you. Good. Here is my question. Not everyone had their hand up. And that's a pretty heavy moment, actually, if you can, for those folks who didn't have their hand up. And the stakes here are really high, obviously. And so that's a pretty heavy thing to live with. I want to hear from our group here. Well, you all had your hand up. Why should we have hope? Why should we have hope? Who wants to take it? Take it away.
Sure.
Question?
Why should we have hope? If you had asked me about the future of the Great Salt Lake about 4 years ago, I think I would have been really pessimistic. It didn't seem that many people were aware of the situation, what was going on, and fewer people seemed to care than what we were seeing out there. And there's been a wholesale change in public opinion. Legislators have been dealing with people ringing your phones off the hook, as have I, and has Bonnie and Lynn, everybody. And it's amazing to me the transformation that's happened in public opinion over the last few years of people become more educated about the Great Salt Lake and what it means to us from an economic, from an ecological, from a cultural perspective. And I'm just really heartened that so many people raise their hands, because it gives me hope that what we're doing has a chance of being successful.
I think a lot of people want to get on this one. Go ahead, Tim.
I just couldn't resist quoting Wallace Stegner, who said, "It's hard to be pessimistic about the West. This is the native home of hope." And I love that quote. He goes on to say that the reason we tend to think about the West is defined by rugged individualism, but it's actually our ability to work together that what should give us hope. And I think as somebody that's worked for now 6.5 years really on Great Salt Lake, what's rewarding is how much people have come together. I hope that the scope of efforts have become clear. So to this narrative that nobody's doing anything, a lot of people have been working a long time to try to pull the right levers and get this done. And I like to say the eyes of the world are on us, and the track record is poor. If you look around the world, what's happened to saline lakes, but Utah has responded in a rather unique and powerful way, really, and before the ecosystem is damaged beyond repair. So I'm really encouraged by that.
Take it away, Bonnie.
I want to give a non-human response and answer that question and talk about the biology. I think for those of you that heard my talk, I've been reading a lot about not just the vulnerability of the system, but how resilient it is and how the biology is resilient. And I think, we don't have a lot of time, but if we can turn this around in a short window of a couple of years, I think the biology will respond favorably, and that gives me hope. And as I said, I did co-write the obituary for Great Salt Lake in 2019, so I'm not known for being hopeful, but that was intentional to get attention on the problem.
Joel, or go Lynn.
Thank you. I think the fact that where we are, our sense of place, our sense of history, our sense of culture, the recognition of what we've learned from others who have had direct challenges and impacts from saline systems in other parts of the world and in our own Great Basin. I've always thought that we've got to jump on things because of the insights that we've gained from other examples. Tim always refers to the pioneer spirit, right arm. And I think that that's a part of where we need to rely on our persistence and our belief. And so I think hope is capital H-O-P-E.
I'll just kind of wrap this up, but just to give an anecdote, someone in my office, we talk about Great Salt Lake every day in the office at DNR, but someone in the office said, hey, I was coming home from a trip, I was at the airport, and I overheard a conversation, just two random strangers, and they were talking about Great Salt Lake and the elevation of Great Salt Lake. Have you seen the Great Salt Lake? What's it doing? And it has become into the awareness of the average citizen here in the state of Utah. We are laser-like focused on it, not just as a government, not just as a department, not just as policymakers, but as the people. And when people get engaged and they start to focus their efforts on something, good things will happen. And so that gives me a lot of encouragement and hope on this issue. The second thing is, we just finished the legislative session. Normally I would be extremely pessimistic and worried because who knows what those, as a former legislator, I can say this, who knows what all those folks are doing? We don't know. It's hold on to your wallets and count your fingers when you're done shaking hands with those guys, because who knows where the wind's going to blow them, right? But I can tell you, I'm so optimistic because
the legislators in the room are nodding.
Because they know.
I'm just saying.
See, they just went through it. They know. Tim knows. I know. I mean, we know. We all know. But the thing is I'm super optimistic because of the results. Some of these results are going to take a little bit of time to implement, but funding, policies, we didn't get everything we wanted. There's a couple things that I really still think we need. I think we need to have short-term levers. I think that we need to have the ability to do water leasing and system conservation quickly if we need to get emergency water down to the lake in a short amount of time. That didn't happen, but it will at some point. And so I'm very optimistic because of those things, and people are focused on it.
Let's just feel that for a minute, can we? Yeah, we've got this. We have this. It's within our grasp. Let's take. So we have hope, but let's think about this. I mean, we've also seen some of the graphs, some of the things that people said during this session have been quite scary. I've thought about this problem as an existential problem before I came in, and I feel in some ways some people have taken it further than I would have, and I'm thinking I'm more scared about it now than when I started in some ways. So we obviously have a ways to go, and I want to pick up where Joel left off. If we think about what is the most realistic next step, what is it? What is the best realistic next step we can take in your mind? What are there things that come to mind that we should be thinking about as either a state, our communities, ourselves as individuals, organizations, what have you? What is the realistic next best step? Who wants to take it?
I'm going to take notes on this one, guys, because
I want to make a quick statement, which is this discussion that came from the governor this morning about a target elevation and how that wouldn't really do anything. And what Leland said, that we already know what that is. It's really not about a number or a range. What we're talking about is that if we go below that range, there should be action. And he kind of missed that second part. So I want to say that out loud. Like, we're not asking that there just be a number. We have the number. Science tells us the number. We're asking that there be action when we fall below that. And that's what we need to work on and we need to figure out.
So can I just clarify then? You're saying we might know what the realistic best range is.
We do.
But we need to, if we need to define something, maybe it's more important to define the floor and start figuring out at what points do we need to start making dramatic steps, because we might not have time to pivot.
And what are those steps?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, that's beautiful. Good. Anything else? Lynn?
I would say the Bear River water development is a big issue for the lake. And everything that we do, all of our conservation efforts, all of the incentives that we're providing, all of the tools that we're reaping the benefits through legislation that we now have. If Bear River is developed, all of that is really for naught. I truly believe that. 220,000 acre feet annually. That's a lot of water. And that's the lion's share of inflows to Great Salt Lake. I don't think we should go there. I think we should put it to rest.
Brigham, I'd just add, I think the one that I'm thinking about a lot is connecting conservation actions with quantifiable benefits to the lake. And there's a reason we haven't done that yet, but what I mean is we've funded agriculture water optimization. We've done hundreds of millions for secondary metering, all in the spirit of sort of making the entire system better, but without, sort of kind of a hope that water will make it into the lake. And it will. If you store more water in the reservoirs, then in wet years, more water will flow down. If you have dry years, however, it just means that your evaporation will be held in reservoirs and will happen in reservoirs instead of happening in the lake. And so I really think that kind of the next step for me is like, how do we quantify, we did have some great legislation on ag optimization where you start to color that water, but where the public is investing, how can we then move that block of water down to Great Salt Lake? Same thing with secondary metering. If the water conservancy districts are going to see a big benefit in terms of stored water, can't we take a chunk of that and move it down to the lake? And I think it's sort of where the rubber meets the road, actually moving physical blocks of new water into the lake is kind of the next big thing from my perspective.
So there might be a somewhat of a disconnect then between the steps that we are taking, and they are good steps and realistic steps that we've already taken to conserve water, to make sure that at least some of that water that's conserved makes it to the lake.
Yes, and in a measurable, quantifiable way. We're doing a lot of things to sort of prevent the situation from getting worse, but if we're ever going to reverse it, we've got to actually start showing measurable progress with new water coming in.
I think on that point, it's getting wet water to the lake. That's what the lake needs, right? Real, true, additional flows to the lake. And it goes to, preventing something from happening doesn't get new wet water. It stops more water from being taken out, right? But at critical steps, all of these things. And we've talked a lot about different processes and programs and different things that can happen. And I think that to kind of that's really and truly I think my next focus is how can we get more water to the lake? We've created a mechanism now where we are going to be able to identify that conserved water. How do we incentivize those, whether it's a business or in agriculture, incentivize those folks to say, okay, yep, it makes financial sense for me to shepherd this down to the lake. And I think that it's a process. These are huge steps. The governor talked about this. I talked a little bit about this. It's not going to happen overnight. It takes more than a year to do these things, but we build on it one step at a time. We get folks comfortable with the process. We can do this. We can measure this. We can provide certainty within the system. And so part of the reason what you saw this year, and especially from the department, what we really pushed for was we need more staff. We need people to be able to go out and measure this water. We need to be able to track it, to trace it, to color it, and meter it. And all of those things help us then get to that next step, which is deliver the water. And that's really where we're trying to go. I think I personally was a fan, and I think that there's a target elevation is a good thing if it has something associated with it. It can't be draconian. Some of the worry was, well, if we get too low, does that mean we start shutting people's taps off? No, we're not going to do that. But what is the proper action? We need to define that. We really need to take time to define what actions are appropriate in this scenario so that we're certainty. We need to provide certainty to the system, right? And I think that's really kind of where I would like to see things to go in the near future, in addition to having additional options, things like a system conservation where we can go and work with a canal company. They may have extra water, pay them some money, they can deliver it down to the lake on a short year. An individual producer, lease water from them, get it down to the lake. Those kind of things, they all take funding. And that's one of the hardest challenges. We don't have a whole lot of dedicated funding sources for water conservation and specifically for the lake itself. And we've got to work on that. We've got to come up with some creative ideas on how do we create those funding sources. How do we pay for them as a society? I'm done.
Not everyone has to jump in, but I don't want to. Okay, good. One of and I'm almost to your questions. I'm just trying to get you to warm up here. Keep posting questions. Keep upvoting them if you like them. I'll get to them. So one of the questions that I think has been swirling around here has to do with Lynn's mention of the pioneer spirit that you mentioned that Tim had, I guess, or that I think that's what you were referring to. I just want to talk to you. I want to hear from you about the culture. What are our advantages of a culture as a society? How are we working? One of the other things that has been noticeable to me is we have. I was talking to our EDR team members last night, and they really got me thinking about a few things. But one of them was, this whole idea of cooperation and deal making. It's connected with conflict, and it's been interesting to me how frequently we're getting things like, we are a team and we can do this. At the same time, we might spill into, well, but so-and-so has to do more, or so-and-so should do more. How do we overcome even that function in culture as we're kind of facing the challenge? If we're going to move together, how are we going to move?
Darren, I was really moved by your presentation, and I took that as an inspiration of possibilities, of a recognition of how to work together, how to regard the resource, how to acknowledge community. And I think, there's a lot of insight that we can gain from considering other cultural perspectives, other foundational understandings. so again, I'm hopeful, and I think the goal is to engage and open up doors and windows and learn to communicate and to trust.
I want to join on to Lynn's comment just because I was also going to reference Darren Perry's talk. You're a treasure. Thank you. I think one of the lessons that I've learned listening to Darren talk and thinking also about the human history in this valley. The humans didn't first come here in 1847. In fact, they were here during the time of Lake Bonneville, during the Pleistocene, during the last ice age. Humans moved down the lake levels as Great Salt Lake formed. So humans have been here for a long time. And one of the things that John Wesley Powell told Congress when he gave his big report was that if you guys are going to move out west with the numbers that you're talking about, you're going to need to live like the indigenous people live. And that means living within natural watersheds. That was one of his major points. You can't, there's not enough water in the West if you dam it up and you treat it like this greedy resource. And another thing was that private companies should never hold water. And that whole community spirit was from his time of spending with indigenous people. And so I do think there's wisdom in looking towards what we can learn from the humans who have been here longer than us white people.
I just say I think about a primary song I grew up with, which is "Kindness Begins with Me." It seems like conservation begins with me is probably a pretty good motto. Leland, you touched on this. I think the temptation I see in Great Salt Lake is to solve it on somebody else's back or to use somebody else's action or inaction as an excuse not to do something. I'll start saving when you hear that ... right? And that is just a terrible way to think about solving tough problems. We need to start with what we can control and to do our part and then all sort of live together.
Yeah, I'll jump on that one too. I think culturally, Utah is a very unique place. There's a reason that so many people want to move here. Our net migration is now coming, or our growth is now in migration and not natural population growth, so births. People want to be here, and it's because we have this unique culture. And so two things. I'm taking a group next week. We're going to Israel to look at water conservation efforts there. We're looking at doing some partnerships with them because they truly are a world leader in conservation. And so here in the U.S. and kind of a common nursery rhyme is how we train our kids: rain, rain, go away, come again another day. Right? We don't want the rain here. Why? What are we thinking? And in Israel, they have a nursery rhyme that it's raining, I don't know, it's in Yiddish, and you clap your hands and shout for joy, right? They're happy that it's raining. And so just culturally, we have got to change who we are and how we consider this precious resource of water. And it starts in the home, starts in our school system. I mentioned this before, but we're making big investments as a state to implement some water curriculum, water conservation curriculum, and that's going to make a big difference generations to come.
And I'd like to follow up on that. I'm not a native Utahn. I had to learn to experience and fall in love with the Great Salt Lake. And that's something that the educational programs that you're talking about and getting people out to the lake so that they can see what an amazing place it is. And then you start to have that cultural connection. And as soon as you do that, the vestiges of partisanship fall away. And we all realize that, in fact, we are all in this together. And this is one thing that we can all pull in the same direction.
Great. Thank you. It's funny. I've heard one of our core team members here at the University of Utah, Jan Nystrom. She mentioned that this whole process is it's a marathon and a sprint. And then another friend of mine, Ben Abbott, told me it's a marathon that starts with a sprint. And there are a few comments here that kind of get at, okay, if we're in the sprint phase, are we sprinting fast enough? And I'll just, are these legislative policies enough? There's so much talk of urgency, but are we slow moving? Are we moving too slow? Is it too incremental? And I realize we can only do what we can do, but I just think we need to kind of, I think a gut check about, thinking about our past performance as not necessarily a critique of the past, but maybe a pathway forward, moving ahead. It's offered in that spirit. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that one. I think, as I hope is clear to folks, I mean, the pace of change, if you talk about water law and how slowly it changes, the pace of change here in the state of Utah over particularly the past 2 to 3 years, has been nothing short of breathtaking. And having people like the governor and Speaker Wilson really dig in and engage on this issue, it's amazing the public investments that we've seen and the policy changes that we've seen. Now, to the question I think that's interesting is it enough? Well, the proof's kind of in the pudding, right? And the lake is still in a crisis, and honestly, had the state not taken 2 very bold steps to raise the adaptive management berm here recently, this summer the ecosystem could very well skate off a cliff, and so I think we need to be aware that as much as we've done and as hard as we've worked, that it isn't enough, and we have to pivot into some of these things where we can actually show not that we're even just not getting slightly worse, but that we are getting it back. We can't serve at 4188, right? We've got to start clawing back and putting some of the safety cushion back into this ecosystem. So, of course, there's more we got to do.
I'm just going to throw in this comment. It's more of a rhetorical question, but it's been upvoted so much. I just want everybody in the room to hear it. Hold on one second. I've got it here. Why don't we have these Great Salt Lake level graphs in the Salt Lake City Airport?
That's a great point.
It's a great point. It is a beautiful point.
We should do it.
Yeah.
A plus.
Who gave that question?
Yeah.
Good job.
Yeah. Well done.
2 points for you.
There is a number of questions here about, given where we are on the lake, and we've certainly heard a lot about this question, but I think it's one of the things that every time you have to deal with some bad news, and you start out with denial, but eventually you get to, we have some hard choices to make. There's some questions about what are the hard choices we can make, and I'll just, like this one says, the physics here requires between 400,000 to 100 million acre feet of water conservation to reverse the lake's decline. Current policies are not nearly enough to even make the 400,000 acre feet. Where will the rest come from? I've asked you to think about the first easy steps, the most pragmatic places to start. I want you to kind of think about sort of that bigger picture. How are we going to do this?
I guess I'd like to start on that one to say that 400,000 acre feet deficit is on average. And we really need to leverage these wet years when we do have water availability. Because when we have these depressed flows like we had the last year, the inflow to the Great Salt Lake was really minimal, sort of thing. So you really have to focus in on those few wet years to get us to where we need to be.
And I just want to kind of underline this. This is culturally, I think this is a difficult thing. And I don't think it's culturally based on where we are, but it's just human nature. That I think that one of the things that ends up happening is people say, we've got a wet year, we don't need to worry about it this year. And actually, just the opposite is true. Mm-hmm. If we want to make headway on the problem, this is the way we can most meaningfully get a lot of water into the lake without a lot of pain. Okay. Any other comments on that one? Where are we going to get that? How are we going to make up the deficit, whatever the number is?
I think Dr. Perry is spot on. This year, so put in perspective, the last 2 years, we had 750,000 acre feet, 800,000 acre feet of total inflow into Great Salt Lake. This year, if who knows what the runoff's actually going to be, but if it's similar to a 2017, 2005, we're talking 2.5 million acre feet plus or minus. You're talking about multiple times greater inflows into the lake. And so taking advantage of these big water years, I can tell you as a farmer myself, on a year if I get a full allocation of water, it's a lot easier to go from 100% to 90 than it is to go from 50% to 40 on a dry year, right? So those years when you have plenty are the years that you can give some. And it goes for us in the cities as well. I mean, this is not just a one size fits all, but there's opportunity there. If we take action, we make those quick steps now. And I can tell you, I mean, I was just looking, every one of these things that we're doing. Yeah, I mean, let's see, secondary meters, 60,000 acre feet when it's fully implemented. Cloud seeding, up to 100,000 acre feet in the Great Salt Lake watershed on a good year. Ag optimization, several 100,000 acre feet of water. So turf buyback, 20,000 acre feet. All of these things, none of them are enough by themselves. Then you combine that with something like what the church did, what the LDS church did, donations of water in addition to these conservation efforts. All of a sudden, the math makes sense.
Yeah, the idea of the silver buckshot came out of this, and I think that's I do think that we need to be realistic. That say, for example, the church's donation, it's 20,000 acre feet. If you need 1 million acres total, it's 2% of the problem, whatever. But you say to yourself, if it's big enough to actually make a percentage or a half a percentage or a quarter of a percentage, this is really meaningful progress, right? And so just kind of thinking about how to sew these things together. But I still think, and just kind of pushing back a little bit, I think that once we get done with the silver buckshot, we still have a hill to go. And I think that that's a challenge. I think one of the things that is kind of in the comments from an earlier set of questions is, there seems to be some questions about can X parties be regulated, or can we pay X parties? And I think that even that question, should we take water, or should we pay for water, or should we confiscate water, or should we pay for water? It totally changes the psychology, both of the politics of, is it possible to get through the legislature, but also if you think about whoever the party is, whether it's cities or farmers or whoever, it totally changes how that's going to be received too. So I think we have to kind of think through how we're going to get there. Here is a question that this says, with Utah having some of the lowest water prices in the nation, is there a discussion of raising water prices to financially encourage water conservation, as Leland suggested? I'm just going to note here for Leland that one of my other top comments, it was for a previous panel, but Leland is my hero, was one of them. So hats off to you, I guess. But what about this, raising water prices?
I'll just tackle that, and I'm sure some people might have some other thoughts as well. I do think it's interesting, and absolutely, it makes sense if you understand anything about markets that properly pricing water is an important piece of the puzzle. I do think people overestimate just how much power it has. They think that just changing pricing alone will just suddenly magically save the Great Salt Lake. There's interesting studies on pricing that show that when you raise the pricing, people tend to use less, but then as they get used to the higher payments, their behavior tends to drift back. Their usage rates tend to drift back up. Because of that, water conservancy districts invest a lot in it, but the returns often in sort of education on conservation and aren't as great as you might think. So even raising prices, doubling prices, sometimes you just don't see the response. One of the things that I think is one of the most powerful things I've seen in public policy is secondary metering, because secondary metering does not change somebody's pricing. It simply tells people how much they're using relative to how much they used last year, and how much they're using relative to their neighbors. Right. And that social pressure that, oh my gosh, I'm using double what my neighbors are, not only has a dramatically greater effect in conservation than changing pricing, but it's lasting. So you see numbers of 20 to 40% reduction in use, and it persists over time by simply giving people information so that they can make informed decisions. That's pretty powerful. So of course it's a piece of the puzzle, but it's not the only piece. It's only one BB, not all the BBs.
And I'll just, one thing that we are doing, legislation has just passed, I think it was SB 118. It's the landscape bill. Public pressure, right? We are requiring, in that bill, we required every city to report to Water Resources what their current ordinance is on new construction. Because we're talking about, spending all this money to change, like the water meter program is on existing homes. What about these thousands and thousands of new homes that are coming in every year? Every year we're building 10, 20, I don't know how many homes, lots of homes. We need to make sure that they are adopting new standards so that we don't have to go out and spend hundreds of millions of dollars in the next 20 years to retrofit them as well. So we're saying, in your city, this is the ordinance on landscaping and water use. And we're doing a dashboard so that the citizens can go and they can say, what is my city ordinance on new construction? So now all the new homes and the people can rise up and say, we don't want this. We don't want you to require us to have half-acre lots and 70% of our outside landscape has to be grass or whatever, right? We want to have higher densities. We want to have better, land use ordinances to promote conservation in that. And we can give the people the power so they can go and change the way their cities are run. That's one of those changes that got put into legislation that is coming out now. Great stuff.
Yeah, I would say with that as a foundational, working place, a public education campaign. We've got the Utah Waterways now, and just when Leland had us raise our who did? How many people use seatbelts when they were kids, or how many people use seatbelts now? I really do think that just like with that as an example, there was a time when you just didn't even think about it, and it's different now mostly. But I think that we can really make an impact to help enhance these mechanisms to change the paradigm of behavior, since we basically are the major contributor to the problem with the lake. So it seems like an easy target.
And I just want to add one thing, that it comes to new construction, the decisions that you make in terms of landscaping lock in the water footprint for decades, because it's so much more expensive to go back and redo it once you already have it in place. And so having those conversations as a requirement of part of the permitting process just seems to make sense to me.
They say that a thing that's said in agricultural communities, sometimes the last harvest is asphalt, and if you think about it, it's pretty hard to till that asphalt once it's there. So it's a problem both directions, right? Okay. We had one person who asked, "What time is happy hour?"
Seriously,
we've got 20 minutes or so left. Hang in there. We'll get there.
this was happy hour.
Yeah. Let's see what we've got here. One of the newer questions that we have is how much time will this wet year buy us? We've heard that phrase. We're grateful for the wet year. Or we should celebrate the wet year. Obviously, we won't know until the snow melts. But give us your best. Yeah.
Quick hit, 1 year, maybe 2. That's what it buys us.
I mean, you think about it. Traditionally, lake goes up, lake goes down. We know it goes down about 2.5 feet from its summertime or runoff peak, right? Mm-hmm. So if we go up 3 to 5 feet this year, that buys us 2 years max.
Yeah, we're down 2.8 feet by November.
Yeah. And so you're talking, what does it really buy us? A couple years at the most. It does give us a little bit of breathing room. It will help us significantly on our salinity, which I think is probably the most important thing that it does. But ultimately, we're not out of the woods.
And if I would just mention that this closing off of the North Arm and now focusing on the South Arm Basin as this new water comes in, we're really having to maybe reinvent the equation to understand salinity in the South Arm, because we haven't ever seen the system like this in this constrained way. We don't know how much of the North Arm water is really seeping under the causeway. We don't know how much groundwater is contributing to salinity. It's kind of a big experiment. So in terms of predicting what the salinity will be, also the South Arm will go up higher in elevation because we're not also filling the North Arm with the inflows. So I think we're going to have to develop, some new equations to kind of figure out where the salinity load comes from, and hopefully it's going to be good. So I think this is going to be an interesting year to monitor that.
Okay. Anyone else on that one? Okay. So this is this. We hear wet year. It's important to act on a wet year. The legislative session is over, right? There's not going, unless there's an interim session, but it does not seem that there's going to be any more legislative session to be had. Given that, how can we best still take advantage of whatever opportunity the wet year is giving us? I mean, we recognize that the legislative session was what it was, but is there any role for any player, and if who, what can we do, if anything?
So I think there will be interim. I'm certainly looking forward to some further study on particularly HB 538. Was that the bill? Yes. And you may be familiar with that bill. That was sponsored by Representative Doug Owens, and it has to do with the incorporation of a shoulder season and translating that shoulder season where, I don't know, say from whatever the dates were, September to May or April. I think it was debatable at the time, which was one of the sticking points. But creating a shoulder season of, no watering lawns, turf, whatever, whatever those limitations were, and accounting for that conserved water to be committed to Great Salt Lake. But it's a conversation that was initiated, which was worthy and timely and needs more conversation around it. But I'm looking forward to an outcome that with the next session, perhaps this bill can run again and, make it through the finish line.
I think it's important to note that the entire watershed is highly managed, and decisions that we make on where that water is stored when it's released have a critical importance on timing for storage for use, but also ultimately on what gets down to Great Salt Lake. So that's where the water management aspect of this comes in, and I think that's a crucial aspect of that this year.
Let me just say, we need those water managers to be a little more aggressive. There's no way you solve this without getting people a little bit out of their comfort zone. And if you watch the hydrographs and you watch the meters, a lot of these dams have just been shut tight because that's engineers doing what engineers do best, right? They're holding on to that water. But we need a little bit of leap of faith, particularly in a wet year, for people to have the courage to do something that maybe is a little less comfortable and let those blocks of water go. Let me just say, too, conservation actions, again, I think it's going to be difficult for the public to understand that just because we had one good water year, it's not just, you can't just suddenly turn around and water like there's no tomorrow with all of the adverse consequences that we see from that kind of thing.
So one of the questions, there might be some simple lines that we can draw, and certainly the line of the temporal line that no watering before such a date, or maybe even combining. If you choose to water, you get really high water prices if you water before such a date. We could put that money towards conservation of the Great Salt Lake or something. One of the big questions that we have about lines, though, is we've been hitting on, should we think about the range, if we think about what the floor is or what the ideal is, whatever, once the range, is the critical factor here feet or is it salinity? How should we be thinking about, if we're going to set a bar, how should that bar be expressed?
So I'll just say I think it's both. In the very short term, it's salinity. That's a very acute and kind of a like precipitous cliff that we fall off of when it gets too high. That longer term, and it's something that we can address in a shorter term. I think we can take quick, immediate action to address salinity. That longer term is truly volumes of water that just don't exist. And if everyone it's a little bit pessimistic, and I don't like it when people say, well, if I shut everything off and I drained every reservoir, it still wouldn't bring the Great Salt Lake back up to full. Well, okay, but that's not what we're asking people to do. We recognize there's a long-term commitment. Decades. It took us decades to get here. It's going to take us decades to get out. But we've got to take action. We've got to start and take that action now. So it's both short-term salinity, I think, long-term lake elevations and health of that broader lake system.
I also like what Lynn talked about thinking about the watershed. So it's not just about the lake. We also need to broaden our view.
Let's talk a little bit about that watershed. One of the things that is striking, if you think about different municipalities have different shares of water, and different municipalities are more or less committed to conservation. But I think that one thing that has been frustrating to some municipalities is that when they might be on a no water zone, that other municipalities don't really seem to be picking up their slack. Is there anything that can be done about that?
I think it's a tough one because of the way water is managed in the state. It's interesting, in northern Utah, Weber Basin Water Conservancy District, at some point last summer, they were worried about having enough drinking water. And so there was rather onerous one-time-a-week restrictions. If you cross the county boundary moving south into Salt Lake County and Utah County, in many cases, there were no water restrictions last summer, even in the midst of the worst drought, in living memory, no water restrictions. And that's because the water conservancies to the south are sitting on a bunch of storage from the Central Utah Project. And so they look up in their reservoirs and they say, well, why should we put everybody on restriction? I think that, but you're pointing to a very difficult aspect of water, which is, while it is a consummate public resource, it's owned by all of us collectively. The way it's managed is it's managed in little tiny pieces. Water Conservancy District has contracts, federal contracts, and they have water rights. And then irrigation companies, canal companies, they all have them. And you can't, in many cases, you can't just force them. You can't just wave a magic wand and say, thou shalt do this within our system of water rights. And so how within that very complicated system do you get all these actors to work together? I mean, this is why this is hard work.
Okay. I got so engaged I wasn't looking at the slide. Hold on one second.
Recruitment district. I live in immigration.
Has there been any conversations with other states regarding how to get water in the Great Salt Lake? So the watershed goes beyond our state boundaries. Do we know anything about what's going on with other states in that watershed?
Yeah, I'll take this one on. This is a tough question, but we have constant negotiation. I can tell you. So there is water importation occurring right now from the Colorado River. So the return flows coming off of the Central Utah Project are getting into Utah Lake. I mean, literally Utah Lake last summer would have been all but dry had it not been for those Central Utah water return flows. I mean, that's how desperate that situation was. So it does. I can't remember the number. Where's Jake's not here. it's a significant amount. Tens of thousands of acre feet of water are making it to Great Salt Lake from that project. That's import water. Now, on the other side of things, Bear River is also a multi-state river, and there is a multi-state compact that exists there. And we have been working with our neighboring states, Idaho and Wyoming, to help them recognize the importance of Great Salt Lake as we look at how we're administering and utilizing the water resource that exists there. And Bear River happens to be the largest contributor to Great Salt Lake. It's the most, it delivers more water to Great Salt Lake than the other two rivers combined. And so helping them recognize that their water doesn't just end at their border, that they need to be mindful of the impact, because there is that nexus, right? Even though Great Salt Lake's not in Idaho, it's important to them. It needs to be important to them. And so we are having those discussions and working with them as we plan for the future.
Do I remember from Sarah Null's work, or one of her papers, that like 40% of the Bear River inflow would be coming from Idaho? Is that right?
Of like a headwater origination?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay.
We have our Bear River commissioner or federal. I don't know. I'm sorry, Jody. I don't know. Do you know, Jody?
In Utah.
In Utah, but how much source water is coming out of Idaho, like, up through immigration and up through soda? I don't know.
The majority of it is made in Cache Valley.
And the UN is?
I think 40% is high for Idaho.
Okay.
Okay.
So just for folks listening online, the response was 40% is high for Idaho.
I'll tell you what, Bonnie, I will have our team of
The
professionals
strike team.
at the Department of Natural Resources get me that answer, and I'll get it to you. Okay?
Good.
Good
That's
question.
great.
And this
Well-
is something that I don't know the answer to, but I'm sure somebody up here does, and that is water rights that Idaho has that they're not currently using. Is that a potential big drawdown on the Bear as well?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Those of you who think Idaho might be hard to deal with, the Aral Sea is in the watershed of 9 countries that basically don't talk to each other. So
And look what happened to it.
Yeah, I know. So we better talk to Idaho.
Kevin, to your question, Idaho has, so part of that the compact on the Bear River allocated additional development rights to Idaho, Utah, and Wyoming. And on the lower Bear, Idaho still has an additional 125,000 acre feet of water to develop. They have the first right to develop theirs before we, as a state of Utah, develop any of ours as well. So, and Utah actually is allocated more than just the 220,000 acre feet. So you're talking about an additional potential 400,000 acre feet of development that has been authorized through that compact. So it's significant. It's a big hurdle we have to overcome.
Have we given up on the north arm of the lake? Have we just given up on it?
Well, I'll handle that one. Absolutely not. Right. I think that what we've talked about here is sort of, we've got short-term need to save salinity in the South Arm, to protect that salinity in the South Arm. But, the North Arm's part of the overall ecosystem. And one of the reasons we can control salinity in the South Arm is because you got this differentiation between the two bays. It's interesting, on a supremely wet scenario, the ecosystem that's in the South Arm can shift to the North Arm. And so absolutely no, I don't think we've given up on it. Yeah, I think that's the answer.
And if I could speak for the pelicans for a moment, there's 85,000 nesting pelicans out on Gunnison Island that have been there for centuries. Stansberry's artist drew them in his expedition book. There have been pelican bones found in caves around the lake. They've been there a really long time, and I'd hate for us to give up on protecting them. And keeping water in the North Arm also means protecting them.
Yeah. And I would say that the North Arm, it is really a hard decision to take some of those kind of emergency actions. North Arm is a critical component of the lake that we want to see viable, strong, thriving in the long term.
I know I already spoke, but let me just say, I think one of the consequences of failing to arrest declines is it will force us into very painful triage type decisions. If you look at other terminal lakes, if you look at the Aral Sea, that's what they did. I mean, ultimately what they tried to do is just dam up these little tiny lakes to replace the great big one, because that's all they could do. And that's just not where we want to be.
Yeah, the Great Salt Lake Advisory Team, one of the policy recommendations that we endorsed was the raising of the berm and the temporary cutting off of the northern arm, in part because we, as that lake recedes in the northern part, temporarily at least, it's covered by a very thick layer of salt. So it's not going to be an extra dust source in the near term, but it's not something that the Great Salt Lake Strike Team was thinking as a permanent solution. It's a temporary emergency measure to deal with the salinity crisis.
All right. So we've heard so many praise those who have taken action one way or another. As I say that, I do realize that we might not have been as grateful as we should have been over the last couple of days for the Great Salt Lake Collaborative and all the things that the media has done to bring attention to this. I think without them, a lot of us would just be like, the what? So, but here is a question about other entities that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about. How are we setting expectations for corporations and businesses or developers to conserve water in the same way that we've talked about the individual or the state or the city having a responsibility?
I can speak to that wearing a former policymaker hat. I mean, that was one of the things we really tried to do in the economic development space, is try to get decisions that are often made silos to speak to each other. So if you're in the governor's office of economic opportunity, we used to call it GoEd, right? Your job is to incentivize companies to come here. And they would not consider, it wasn't even on their radar screen to consider whether that business that they were incentivizing to come to Utah used a bunch of water. And we actually saw them bring in data centers and things like that. And again, it's not through any malicious intent. They're just trying to bring jobs in, particularly high-tech jobs. And so I think one of the things that we have made some headway in, but there's still a ways to go, is thinking about, if we're going to incentivize a company to come here, what is their footprint? What is their impact on our water, our air, our roads? And we need to take that into account if we're, as we evaluate people coming here. So I think we have seen some steps in a positive direction. I think there's still some way to go. I think we just incented another big company to come up here that'll use 1,000 acre-feet of water a year. It's going to bring a ton of jobs. It's really a dynamic company. It's probably great for where it lands. But I still think we have a ways to go if we're still incenting that kind of economic activity.
And I think being more discerning, don't we provide a tax break incentive to bring companies here because they're so desirable? And yet we here on the home team are trying to figure out, what the hell are we going to be doing? And the money that, basically we're encouraging that kind of industrial development or businesses to come that use lots of water, even as Salt Lake City has done by putting a cap on the amount of water. It's still, in my mind, it's a major disconnect that we need to figure this out and change something.
Yeah, I would just say, kind of, my thought on that is this is one of those disconnects that exists where you have a state agency mandated to bring in jobs without that recognition. What does that bring in? Brings in more people, because it's not just the business. I mean, that business is using a lot of water. Those people it's bringing with it are going to use a lot of water too. So how do we balance that, right? That's having these plans in place. One thing that we did do in the commissioner bill is, I think part of this is driven by there's a little bit of a disconnect between how much water is really available for development and how much are we using. There's kind of a lag. Cities are out there growing. And in the commissioner bill, we put in there an actual seat at the table for the Board of Water Resources representing Great Salt Lake. So Board of Water Resources is an arm that does a lot of water development from the Division of Water Resources, and they approve a lot of big projects. And so to have that be a focus of new development and growth, and where the resources of the state are going to be put to promote new development, it'll be a huge shift in mentality, I think, and give a recognition to, okay, what is the impact of this to Great Salt Lake? So again, fundamentally not earth-shattering, but something that will guide or help get us there in the long term.
Thank you. We're getting close to time. Just each of you briefly, what should we take away from this as we walk out? What should we take away from this?
You have to start at this end, or are we going to go? Okay.
I'll go first, so you guys can think about it. This motley crew, we're going to
has
say
all the answers. That's the thing I love about Tim.
The thought that's been in my mind is just sitting here on this panel is John F. Kennedy laid out a vision to put a person on the moon. And if you think about the technology that was available at that time, the hurdles that were associated with that, but he called sort of on the best of Americans with this super ambitious goal, and by golly, we pulled it off. And I think this is kind of, Utah's moonshot moment. I mean, this is going to call for us to fundamentally revisit basic assumptions about what our yard should look like and how we grow and what our, all of these things. And to do it, we can't do it on the cheap. We can't do it easy. It takes bold action and discomfort. And so I hope people just realize that there is no silver bullet. As many people have said today, it's going to take a lot of hard work from a lot of people. And I think, as the speaker said, we're just getting started.
Others?
I think the eyes of the world are looking upon us, that because this is something that is within our control. And in a small microcosm, if the people of Utah can pull together and address this very serious environmental concern by thinking outside the box, by doing things that are difficult, it raises hope for people around the world that we can tackle larger issues. And if we fail in this endeavor on something that we have control over, I think we failed the world.
Yeah. So this man is driving down a country road, and there are cows everywhere. And he has car problems. And he pulls over, lifts up the hood. He's looking under the hood, and he hears, moo, carburetor. He looks around, nothing but cars. Nothing but cows. And he goes back under the hood, moo, carburetor. Finally, he tinkers with the carburetor. It was the carburetor. The car starts, he drops the hood, drives up to the farmer's house. The farmer comes out, the man says, you're not going to believe this, but I was down your road having car problems, and one of your cows told me that it was the carburetor. And sure enough, here I am. And the farmer's like, oh, that is utter nonsense. She doesn't know a thing about cars. But the takeaway from that is, we know a lot about what we can do, and we know our responsibility to make it so. And we know we don't want to lose Great Salt Lake. So we have to be the moo carburetors. Get the message out, help fix the problem, and I believe we can do it.
Thank you, Lynn. That's my favorite Lynn joke right there. It's very ag-centric, so I can relate. Yeah. But no, I just want to kind of a takeaway from my perspective is a sense of optimism. I do think that we are putting in place policies, funding appropriations, and changing people's attitudes to make a difference. I think the future is bright. I do think that while we don't all have to be experts on these subjects, we all can make a difference. We can all do our part. We can share this message of conservation, of responsible use of these precious resources. And together we can get through this. And I'm very, very encouraged by what I'm seeing. And ultimately from the state as the governor said, we're not going to let Great Salt Lake die on our watch. So.
I'm just going to end by putting an asterisk on that optimism that the timeline is short. We need to get water to the lake, and we need to do it quickly. That's all I have to say.
Great. I'm going to turn thank you. I'm going to turn the mic over to my colleague. But before I do, I'm just going to take moderator's privilege and read this quote by Wallace Stegner. And this comes from, most appropriately, the book called The Sound of Mountain Water. Joel referenced it earlier. One cannot be pessimistic about the West. This is the native home of hope. When it fully learns that cooperation, not rugged individualism, is the quality that most characterizes it and preserves it, then we will have achieved itself and outlived its origins. Then it has a chance to create a society to match its scenery.
Let me say I appreciated all of those relatively optimistic and heartwarming remarks here at the end, including the quotation from Wallace Stegner. My remarks are going to be a little more mundane, but first of all, we've had a couple of questions about whether the program over the last 2 days and the presentations will be available, and they will eventually be up on the Wallace Stegner Center website, so this will be available. Secondly, I'd like to note that we will be publishing our keynote speakers' presentations or remarks, perhaps in a slightly different form, along with Darren Perry has given us permission to publish his remarks. We thank you, Darren, for that. So the Stegner Center and the University of Utah Press will be publishing those in a form similar to the pamphlets that you've seen in the entry door. Let me remind you that evaluation forms for the annual symposium are available online. We'd appreciate taking the time to complete them. It gives us a sense of what we did right, what we could improve upon, what we might have done wrong. And we also, those evaluation forms, if I recall correctly, ask for suggestions for future programs, and we pay attention to those suggestions. They're also important to our funders. Let me also note that we've got 4 more Stegner Center noon green bag programs coming up between now and the middle of April. The information is available on the website. They cover a wide range of subjects related to the West, the environment, including one on aridity. So please join us for those. It would be appropriate at this point for me to say thank you, not only to this final panel for taking the time to spend with us, but likewise to all of the presenters that we've had over the last 2 days. I think we've learned an awful lot about the Great Salt Lake and the challenges that we all confront. Let me also say thank you once again to the R. Harold Burton Foundation, our founding donor for the annual symposium. Thank you also to the Cultural Vision Fund, as well as the S.J. and Jesse E. Quinney Foundation and the Nature Conservancy in Utah. And finally, let me say thank you to all of you for joining us for the last 2 days, and we look forward to seeing you next year for the 29th annual Wallace Stegner Center Symposium. Thanks again.